All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Where I'm at right now, it's about 2:43 p.m. and today is January 8th, and we are reading the book right here you see on the screen, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th-Century South by Martha Hodes. This book came out in 1997. Don't believe that it came out in 1999. It's actually a 1997 piece. You can buy it on Amazon for only $24.08. Yesterday, we finished chapter 3. Basically, that was the story of this. Let me just look back. Let me look back. Basically, yeah, I remember. It was a story about bastardy. Yeah. So this guy named Jim. He was a black slave in the Deep South in the early 18th century, and he was working alongside this woman named Polly, who was a white servant who lived in the house. Polly accused Jim of rape. The town people convict Jim of rape, and as you would imagine, Jim, being a black man accused of rape of a white woman, was expected to be killed, murdered. But actually, the townspeople spoke up when they found out that Polly was pregnant, and the level of pregnancy that she had doesn't correlate to the time she got raped. Plus, also, unfortunately, people back then thought that a woman couldn't get pregnant from rape, so they eventually let Jim free. A story that, you know, should surprise a lot of people if you're familiar with how we regularly think about interracial relationships between black men and white women, and how that caused white men usually to go into lynch mobs and murder black people and stuff like that. So this book here is telling the history that not a lot of people know. And I was thinking about this yesterday, right? Like, you know, there are a lot of, racist white folks who say that, slavery wasn't that bad, or, segregation wasn't that bad and stuff like that. I wonder if they would read this book and then use this to bolster their claims. Like, see, we didn't always hate black people. We used to let the black men smash our wives and not kill them. We used to let black men have sex with white women all the time. I wonder if they would ever say that. But I think that would not be something that comes out of their mouths, because deep down in their core, they're actually racist. So they actually don't even like hearing these types of stories. I was thinking about that yesterday. But anyway, we're going to be reading chapter 4 today of this book. I'm trying to get through this book as fast as I can, because actually tomorrow I'm traveling to Louisiana. So y'all look out for me in the States. If any of y'all want to catch the fade, if any of y'all want to shoot me, kill me, do anything to me for all the stuff I've been talking online these past few years, you can catch me easily in my hood, Monroe, Louisiana, 71201. Not hard to find. But we're going to be reading only chapter 4 today. Maybe I'll come back on live to read chapter 5 later. Catch this on the playback and go watch parts 3, 2, and 1 before watching this one. And if it helps you at all, watch it on 2x speed. So let's get into it. Chapter 4, Adultery, Dorothea Bourne and Edmond. If a married white woman in the antebellum South gave birth to a child whose father was presumably black, she was likely to be the subject of considerable scrutiny and judgment. Even without pregnancy and childbirth, suspicion of a white woman's adulterous liaison with a black man could become a fervid topic of local conversation. The seriousness of the matter and the actions taken, however, would depend more upon the woman's white husband. If he chose to remain silent, there might be talk, but no concerned effort either to prove the transgression or to put a stop to it. If instead the white husband presented himself as a wronged man, friends and neighbors would be apt to cooperate in the legal investigation to support his claims. A white husband who proved his wife guilty of adultery with a black man was usually granted the divorce he requested, precisely because authorities had always swayed that the white wife was at fault. Yet white husbands were not guaranteed divorces under such circumstances. The gravity of breaking up a white family through divorce could outweigh the gravity of illicit sex between a white woman and a black man. Regardless of the verdict, antebellum divorce cases and other recorded instances of adultery based on the transgressions of white wives with black men confirm a marked absence of white outrage and violent retribution toward the participating black man, whether slave or free. In 1824, an elderly white man named Louis Bourne asserted publicly that his much younger wife, Dorothea, also called Dolly, made a habit of associating with black men in their Virginia Piedmont neighborhood, and specifically that she had been sexually involved with Edmond, one of John Richardson's 25 slaves, for the past 6 or 7 years. Thus, sex between a white woman and a black man entered the historical record as an offense of adultery. There were no accusations of rape either by Dorothea, her husband, or any other white person. And unlike in the case of Polly Lane and Jim, white neighbors blamed a white woman from the beginning. Dorothea was both bullied and shunned, yet in the end of the circumstances were not grave enough to permit Lewis a divorce. The story of Dorothea and Edmond presents another case of white people's uneasy endurance of a sexual liaison between a white woman and a black man in the slave South. Their story, too, involves dominant ideas about the sexuality of marginal white women, the precedence of a slave owner's property rights over any other white person's reaction to the sexual transgressions of a valuable slave man, and the problem of free children of partial African ancestry. You know, one of the things that I like about this book, once again, it's opening my eyes to another chapter in history that's often overlooked. And it's also, kind of affirming, because when we think about our people in bondage, we think about all the things they couldn't do, all the limitations that they had on their, language, on practicing religion, on their freedom of movement explicitly. Their lives were in the control of other people, right? But this shows that, even during that time, we still had agency. We still had some ability to, have some freedom and some rebelliousness to some degree, right? I'm not saying like, oh, interracial sex or interracial relationships are a type or form of rebellion, right? Because I'm sure a lot of the black guys that were smashing these white girls back then just wanted some booty. There were very little women around, so these loose, poor white women would come and, flaunt that tail in front of the brothers. You get what I'm saying? But this goes to show, like, even during slavery, we showed resistance. We had, full lives. We were beautiful. We were desirable, stuff like that. So that's what I find interesting about this book. But let's continue. So, as in the case of Polly Lane and Jim, the evidence from Dorothea and Edmond's neighborhood reveals local knowledge of the illicit liaison. Many whites testified to familiarity with Dorothea Bourne's transgressions with more than one black man, but especially with John Richardson's slave, Edmond. According to Dorothea's husband, there was no room to doubt that an illicit intercourse was regularly kept up between them, precisely because so many respectable persons knew about it. Indeed, people said that Dorothea had taken up with a black man, was intimate with other men, and had been seen in company with Edmond. Others noted that she had children by a slave, or that some of her children were mulatto. The Bourne and Richardson families resided in the southeastern corner of Louisa County and the bordering western section of Hanover County, a region that contained both farms and plantations. Unlike Polly Lane's family, Louis Bourne could count himself among the small property-holding yeomanry. Like many of his neighbors, he was a farmer who depended little on the market economy of the slave South. Lewis's father had divided his land between two of his four sons, and Lewis was one of the lucky heirs. For the last 15 years of his life, Lewis owned 75 acres of land, placing him squarely among the county's middling folk. Just before he married Dorothea in 1812, he had been able to purchase one slave, though economic straits later forced him to sell his chattel and move in with a brother. By contrast, the Richardsons, who lived within a half a mile of the Bournes, owned more than 400 acres of land in addition to their many slaves. The white people whom Louis Bourne selected to tell the story of Dorothea and Edmond agreed on its broad outlines. The blacksmith Peter Wade, for example, noted of Dorothea that she generally keeps the company of Negro slaves. Nathan Ross similarly testified that Dorothea kept the company of Negro slaves as often or perhaps oftener than any other company. The narrators also agreed that Dorothea consorted in particular with Edmond. Richard Woodson had witnessed considerable intimacy between Dorothea and Edmond's master himself believed that Dorothea had quit her husband and taken up with Edmond because the slave man was younger and more handsome than her spouse. Dorothea and Edmond had even been caught in the act. One winter's night in 1823, Lewis's brother and his servant woman had found Dorothea and Edmond in bed together on the Bourne property. Dorothea and Edmond also carried on their illicit liaison in Edmond's quarters and had been caught there too. John Richardson's wife, Judith, said she had often seen Dolly Bourne lurking about her Negroes' houses. So basically, Dolly was this, young girl married to this older, kind of middle class, white guy who owned a little bit of land, a little bit of slaves, but he's not as wealthy as the guy with 400 acres, right? And Dolly, being a young girl, doesn't really want to sleep with her old white husband. no matter how rich he is or stable he is. And she's, sleeping with the brothers. And the family knows this. They've even caught them in bed together. Once again, this shows that, reading this book has showed me, like, during that time, slavery, of course, was horrible and wicked, but it's no different than human relations now, right? Like, you work some, low paying job at Dollar Tree, McDonald's, Burger King, right? And you rubbing shoulders with, some poor white girl next to you who's line cooking too. And then y'all end up, making out or hooking up, you know what I mean? Smashing in the back, y'all working a late night shift, something like that. I'm sure that's happened to plenty of brothers all across the nation. You feel me? But anyway, continuing here. Neighbors had also witnessed affection, at least on the part of Dorothea. When Daniel Malloy hired Edmond to travel to another town, he observed Dorothea's sorrow at the separation. Thomas Pulliam, who had known Lewis for 20 years, averred that Edmond and Dorothea lived together almost as man and wife. Another witness used the same phrase, adding that Dorothea washed and mended for Edmond in her own home. Dorothea had in fact ceased to cohabit with Lewis and resided instead in a dwelling on the corner of his land. Some white people believe that Lewis consented to this arrangement so that Dorothea might have it in her power to have a more uninterrupted intercourse with Edmond. Basically, they're saying, like, this man built a small little shack for his slave and his wife so that they could basically, bump uglies, make the two backed beasts together. Even he knew, man, I can't control this thing. This situation's out of my hands. Basically becoming a CUCK. Anyway, so finally, the storytellers largely agreed that Edmond was the father of some of Dorothea's children. One of these had died in 1823 at about age 3, and rumors of others had made their way around the neighborhood. Peter Wade had seen the children of Dolly Bourne and had no doubt of some of them being colored. Joseph Perkins swore that Dorothea had children by a slave, adding that no person in the neighborhood doubts it. John Richardson believed that Dorothea's last child was by my man, Edmond. Such statements were echoed by others, including relatives of Lewis and a man who testified that he had made a coffin for the deceased child. As with Polly Lane and Jim, then, the liaison between Dorothea and Edmond was tolerated by white neighbors to a point. There is no way to know whether, if Dorothea's husband had never spoken up, the liaison might have continued without entering the annals of the antebellum South. But because Dorothea and Edmond had a living child or children, Lewis Bourne ultimately decided to seek a divorce from his wife. In the case of the unmarried Polly Lane and the slave Jim, local authorities had seized responsibility and found out the free child of color. But any offspring of Dorothea, including any by a man other than her husband, would have been a burden to Lewis. For the children of adulterine bastardy were the responsibility of the spurned husband. Advising Lewis on the divorce proceedings, the county sheriff had pointedly told him, "You had better do it, Lewis. Otherwise, you will have them mulatto children to support all your life." The presence of one or more children believed to belong to Dorothea and Edmond thus sparked Lewis's plea for divorce, thereby precipitating a local crisis. Only after Lewis decided on that course of action did a group of white neighbors confront the fact of the illicit liaison in a unified and zealous manner. As in the case of Polly and Jim, it was the guilt of the white woman they set out to prove, this time from the start. When Lewis presented his divorce plea before the Virginia legislature in 1824, he had already been gathering depositions about his wife's transgressions for almost 2 years. The story of Dorothea Bourne and Edmond came to be recorded in that collection of narratives, and once again, caution and speculation are required in the recreation of events and sentiments. It is not possible to know all that occurred before Lewis Bourne began to gather his sworn statements intended to justify the legal dissolution of the marriage. In a divorce petition such as Lewis filed, the voice of the wronged husband is easily discernible, and the voices of those who sided with him ring equally clear. Almost none of the witnesses who spoke on behalf of Lewis owned as many slaves as John Richardson, but for the most part, neighbors of good economic standing and status came forward to support a man of precariously middling circumstances. The voices of the transgressors themselves came through haltingly, if at all. The lone person who defended Dorothea was a midwife named Keziah Mosley, a woman who headed her own household. Although Keziah claimed to have delivered all of Dorothea's children and asserted that none had a black father, her testimony was refuted by three men who either counted that Keziah had previously pronounced one of Dorothea's children to be black, or insisted that Keziah had not been present at every birth. The other six women who filed depositions sided with Lewis, as did the 29 men who gave sworn testimony. There was also one anonymous witness. Of course, because Lewis was the gatherer of the depositions, it is impossible to determine how many white neighbors may have defended Dorothea in their own minds. Dorothea commanded no power to call her own defense, both because she was female and dependent and because she had transgressed too many boundaries. In any event, local authorities would likely have considered any supporters unrespectable outcasts. Opinions of the other slaves in John Richardson's household or in the neighborhood are equally difficult to discern. Those who knew the facts may have admired Edmond's defiance or held him in contempt for stooping to consort with a white woman. Okay, so let's just break this all down very quickly. For people that haven't seen the previous three sections, essentially we have to remember, and even if you saw the previous three sections, let's just remember this. At the time, slaveholders were working in tandem to make sure that their slaves weren't punished too harshly so that they wouldn't get killed or thrown in jail forever, because the slaves were investments. So that's why the people were speaking up in the case of Dorothea's husband, the slave owner man, to try to make sure that this woman gets punished for what she's doing. Also, we have to remember at the time, bastardy was a major crime, adultery was a major crime, and patriarchy was even more enforced back then. So women were found more culpable and liable for these sorts of things, right? Continuing here. In the process of proving himself wronged, Lewis Bourne ran into some trouble, for his wife did not wish for the divorce. And although Lewis was able to gather a considerable party of supporters, not all of their recollections worked in his favor. Lewis's probable violent treatment of Dorothea was crucial to the outcome, even though most petitioners painted a favorable portrait, proclaiming Lewis peaceable, honest, industrious, and never disposed to use his wife badly. One such speaker was the public notary, Anderson Bowles, who had been Lewis's neighbor for 29 years. Another was Joseph Anderson, who had known Lewis from infancy. Lewis was said to provide adequately for his family. He and Dorothea had one or two children of their own, except that Dorothea supposedly gave away food and clothing to the black men with whom she fraternized, leading the Bournes into poverty. But Thomas Anderson, who lived within a few miles of the Bournes, also stated of Lewis, "I believed had he married a virtuous woman, he would have made as kind a husband as any man," thereby implying that Lewis did not always treat Dorothea with complete forbearance. Other notes of suspicion also crept into the testimony, echoing this observation. Hannah Bourne, Lewis's niece, who lived next door, said that her uncle never was disposed to be unfriendly to his wife until she had taken to such an infamous course. Joseph Perkins, who had known Lewis for 40 years, agreed that Lewis would have made his wife a good husband if she had conducted herself tolerably well. When Joseph Anderson testified to Lewis's good behavior as a husband, he pointed out that Lewis hadn't known Dorothea was a strumpet. I love that word, strumpet. That's such a funny word, by the way. Known Dorothea was a strumpet until after their marriage. Finally, 11 men, all neighbors of the Bournes, came forward on behalf of Lewis to opine. "We think the many indignities offered Lewis Bourne by his wife has been sufficient to produce one of the few causes in which a husband might feel justified in whipping his wife. It is clear that at least some of the white neighbors considered domestic violence an appropriate course of action for a white husband whose white wife dishonored him by carrying on an affair with a slave, though there is no reason to believe that such violence would not have been sanctioned if Dorothea had consorted with a white man." Although divorce in the 19th century South was neither a common nor a swift process, adultery was one of the grounds for which most state legislatures and courts considered the proceedings justifiable. Yet despite evidence about Dorothea's sexual transgressions with a black man, despite the serious charge of adultery, and despite Virginia laws prohibiting sex between white women and black men, Lewis Bourne was denied his divorce. Lewis's inability to control his wife in spite of his probable violent behavior seems to have settled the matter in his wife's favor. If the beatings had stopped Dorothea's transgressions, there might have been no divorce plea. Because they did not, Lewis became the party at fault. That's so wild to think about. So they're saying you didn't beat your wife hard enough. And so that's why she ended up sleeping with the black man. And so even though the laws of Virginia say that black men can't have sex with white women, that a woman who adulters her husband definitely is going to end up divorced, even though that is the law, you didn't beat your wife hard enough to actually keep her in line, to stop her from having sex with the brothers. So Lewis, unfortunately, you can't get this divorce. That's crazy to think. That was American law. It shows you how far we've come as a society, yet still there's some people that want to go back to that. I'm surprised people really want trad wife life, because that's crazy to think about. This man couldn't get a divorce from his wife, even though she was sleeping with a brother the whole town knew. They got caught several times. And their answer to this man wanting a divorce is that, well, you should have hit her harder. That's crazy. I'll continue here. Other cases bear out this interpretation. Mistreatment was likely the deciding factor in the case of Lucy Whittington of the North Carolina Piedmont, who leveled counter accusations of physical abuse and abandonment at her husband. According to the husband, Andrew Whittington, Lucy had deserted him a month after their wedding in 1823, and after returning had indulged in criminal intercourse with both whites and mulattoes. Andrew claimed that Lucy's 3 children were illegitimate and that one of them was colored. But in Lucy's version, Andrew accused her of having unlawful intercourse with a Negro slave without a shred of evidence and inflicted a most cruel whipping upon her. After a second severe beating, she asserted, Andrew had promised good behavior only to desert Lucy shortly thereafter. The county and appellate courts alike ruled that Lucy was indeed guilty of adultery, but only after she had been abandoned, and therefore denied Andrew a divorce. 2 additional cases from the North Carolina Piedmont are instructive. In 1832, Peggy Johnson pled for divorce after 16 years of marriage, claiming that her husband, John, beat her in drunken frolics, deserted her, and left her destitute. A neighbor vouched that John had kicked Peggy in the face and thrown wood at her. Damn, boys back then were wild with their women, rough on these hoes. Although Johnson encountered that Peggy had formed a relationship with a free black man, he was not granted his divorce. And in the case of Elizabeth Walters, the courts were more interested in her sufferings at the hands of her husband than in proof of her adulterous liaison with a black man. According to Hardy Walters, Elizabeth lived in illicit carnal cohabitation with a Negro slave, became pregnant by him, and had a Negro child. Hardy drew up a divorce petition, and the messenger who delivered it inquired if the charges therein were true. Elizabeth held up the child and said it would show for itself. You see my black baby? That's crazy. Okay. I'm sorry. Elizabeth held up the child and said it would show for itself. Hardy never followed through, and when he died in the early 1850s, Elizabeth hoped to collect her widow's dower. The men defending the deceased Hardy called Elizabeth a lewd woman and a strumpet, but the judges gave greater weight to Elizabeth's assertions that Hardy had seduced her while married to another woman. Elizabeth won the case. The reasoning of legal authorities has not been preserved in other antebellum Southern cases of liaisons between black men and married white women in which divorce was denied. It is clear only that, for example, about a year after their marriage in the Virginia Piedmont in 1806, William Howard learned that his wife Elizabeth was engaged in the most brutal and licentious connections, having no regard to persons of color. One night, William had found Elizabeth undressed and in bed with Aldridge Evans, a man of color. Although Elizabeth continued to pursue her accustomed vicious and licentious course of life, William's divorce plea was rejected. Similarly, even though Tabitha Hancock of Piedmont, North Carolina, purportedly lived at a Negro quarter among Negroes and had children of various colors and complexions, her husband was denied a divorce in 1813. In the case of John and Elizabeth Denver, the two had married in eastern North Carolina in the early 1800s, but within a few years, Elizabeth had suckled at her breast an infant bearing the most certain marks of a colored father. That's hilarious. This is in the early 1800s. This man sees his wife with her new baby, and he can tell that baby looked like Charles Barkley. That's hilarious. Anyway, Elizabeth had, like Dorothea, resided under the roof of a slave for 2 years, and yet John was denied divorce in 1813. Once again, this is fascinating history. This is not one or two white guys. This is multiple white men whose wives got pregnant by black slaves, and they still couldn't even get divorces. Once again, they couldn't get divorces because back then it was a man's duty to keep his woman in line. You had to beat your woman, smack your woman up and down. And if she still didn't behave the way you wanted her to, then the court said, well, you're not doing your job as a man. And so then they said, no divorce for you, buddy. So your wife can literally sleep with a black man, get pregnant, have a baby, have that black baby on her titty. And the courts will say, why didn't you smack her? Enough. That's crazy. This is real American history. This is the history of the great state, the great United States of America. Let's continue here. In Eastern North Carolina in the same year, James Hoffler's divorce plea was rejected, even though Deborah Hoffler lived with a black man with whom she had a child. Wow. Thomas Culpeper of Tidewater, Virginia, claimed that within 6 months of his marriage in 1831, his wife had sacrificed her virtue on the altar of prostitution and was having carnal intercourse with black men or Negroes. Caroline Culpeper presented a different version of the facts, and Thomas lost his case. Neither were white husbands guaranteed divorce on the grounds that their wives had consorted with black men before marriage. True, the husbands of Elizabeth Pettis, Lydia Butt, Peggy Jones, Nancy Newton, and Ann Barden, all of whom accused their wives of having sex with black men before marriage, were granted divorces. But when Marville Scroggins of Western North Carolina claimed that his wife, Lucretia, had conceived the child of a black man before their wedding, the Supreme Court of North Carolina would not grant a divorce, declaring Marville at fault in marrying a woman whom he knew to be lewd. Once again, back then, they're saying, if your wife has a black baby, you should have known better than to marry her. How could you not tell that this woman essentially was a strumpet, a whore, a hoe? You get what I'm saying? So it was crazy. Like back then, the way we thought about, marriages between men and women was so trad wife. This is what the trad wives want. This is what the red pill community wants. We want to go back to not being able to get a divorce. We want no fault divorces because you should be at fault for marrying a hoe. You tried to turn that hoe into a housewife and now you want a divorce? Boy, please, said the Supreme Court of North Carolina. Anyway, so there was, however, a fascinating connection between the Scroggins and Barden divorce cases, both of which reached the state Supreme Court in 1832. After Marville Scroggins was denied divorce, the public outcry forced the court to hand down a different verdict in the Eastern North Carolina case of Jesse Barden. In the words of the Chief Justice, this is a concession to the deep-rooted and virtuous prejudices of the community upon this subject. Although both cases entered the record as adultery, the crime of sex between a white woman and a black man mattered explicitly in the Barden case, precisely because the judges had not explicitly considered it in the Scroggins case. True, Marville Scroggins' lawyer had argued that imagination can scarcely conceive a case which is calculated to awaken a larger share of sympathy in the human bosom, though to no avail for his clients. In this instance, white Southerners forced the judge to rethink his ruling on the subject of sex between white women and black men, perhaps due to the increasing militancy in support of racial slavery after 1830 in response both to the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 and to the growing ire of Northern anti-slavery forces. Although the judge in the Scroggins case may have thought the legal breakup of white families more dangerous than sex between a black man and a married white woman, other people wanted it on record that such adulterous liaisons should not be idly overlooked. Additional clashes between law and community also testified to the potentially volatile nature of sex between black men and married white women in the antebellum South. In 1809, an anonymous citizen of North Carolina expressed consternation in a letter to the editor, citing the case of a man whose wife left him and attached herself to a free Negro by whom she then had several children, but whose divorce plea was rejected. The writer also cited a married white woman who delivered a mulatto child a few months after marrying a white man and whose husband was denied divorce. Such circumstances warranted the legal dissolution of marriage, the writer insisted, for the cases were as plain as the blaze of day. In the eyes of Lewis Bourne's friends, too, the disgraceful conduct of his wife justified whatever abusive behavior he may have displayed and made Lewis entitled to divorce. To the Virginia legislature, however, Lewis's abuse was at least as reprehensible as Dorothea's transgressions. Perhaps legal minds reasoned that breaking up a white family could only magnify weaknesses in Southern hierarchies of gender and race, hierarchies that were not so gravely threatened by a liaison between a white wife and a black man, at least as long as patriarchal authority still operated to some degree within the household, and especially as long as the institution of slavery remained intact. The institution of marriage thus might on occasion require legal preservation to shore up the structure of patriarchy that undergirded racial slavery. Basically what she is saying here, Martha Hodes, is saying, like, you know, at this time, what was more important was just remaining was keeping intact the traditional gender roles, norms, white male patriarchy at top, and racial slavery as a form of subjugation, right? So more important than white women sleeping with black men and the tragedy that is, right? Because they definitely didn't like race mixing, miscegenation, whatever. What's more important is maintaining the structure. And if everybody just gets divorced because their wife cheats on them with a black man, then that, you know, breaks apart marriage. And we want to keep marriages together. Right. Which makes me think about right now how a lot of people are saying, like, oh, you know, marriages are falling apart. The traditional family is going away. It's going extinct and stuff like that. Back in the day, divorces were hard to get for men and women. Society wanted to keep people together, even if they were very bad for each other. That's not what we want. You should be able to find happiness with whoever you want, not be forced to be married to somebody, especially if you want to sleep with the brothers. Continuing here. Divorce laws were liberalized in the first half of the 19th century in the South, principally through a more flexible interpretation of what made a marriage unendurable and a broader definition of what constituted cruelty. This was fostered largely by the development of an ideology that cast women as more virtuous than, physically inferior and legally subordinate to men, and therefore potential victims of their husbands. Divorce laws were formulated largely with the protection of women in mind, and most divorces in the antebellum era were requested by wives. Dorothea Bourne, Lucy Whittington, Peggy Johnson, Elizabeth Walters, and perhaps the other white women whose husbands lost their cases were understood by the law to be victims of their husband's abusive treatment, a circumstance that was apparently more dangerous than their own adulterous behavior, even with black men. The view that it was a husband's duty to control his wife, which contradictorily could also sanction the physical abuse of his wives, was also central to these verdicts. In the Scroggins case, the Chief Justice invoked the marriage vow of for better or for worse, noting that nothing would be more dangerous than to permit one spouse to claim that the other was worse than was expected. Lucretia Scroggins had, it seemed, not matched the ideal of a virtuous woman, and thus the judge opined, he who marries a wanton, knowing her true character, submits himself to the lowest degradation and imposes on himself. Basically, the judge is saying, if you marry a hoe, you're going to get a hoe, and that's what you're going to get, bro. So be careful who you pick out there. The judge was Future. Anyway, I'm continuing here. Sorry. So at the same time, the fact that many white husbands whose white wives had transgressed with black men were indeed granted divorces indicates that convictions about white female virtue and victimization were never uniformly entrenched in antebellum culture. For those convictions did not always or necessarily apply to white women outside the planter classes or to white women who consorted with black men. Thus, if the white wife were judged to be depraved, the husband might win. But if the wife were depraved and at the same time experienced severe abuse in her marriage, the husband could lose. Or to put it another way, if a severely abusive husband was unable to halt such depravity, he could be denied a divorce. Basically, trying to say, you know, if a husband beat his wife too hard, it would be harder for him to get a divorce, right? Because they changed the marriage laws to protect women, right? So they're trying to say, you know, don't hit your wives too hard. If she sleeps with a black man, come to us, brother. We'll help you out. I'll continue here. So, although Lewis and his friends made Dorothea suffer for her transgressions, Lewis had also relinquished more than a measure of his patriarchal authority over his wife. Just as Polly Lane's father was too poor to control his daughter, Lewis Bourne may have been too elderly and infirm to control his wife, who was, after all, part of his property. Whatever children belonged to Dorothea and the enslaved Edmond certainly threatened both the community's racial categories and its racial hierarchy, especially given that white people already considered Edmond to be a very light-complexioned slave. Dorothy's liaison with Edmond might not by itself have mattered to Lewis Bourne in any degree that made it worth his while to seek a divorce from her, especially in light of his ostensible exercising of disapproval through domestic violence. But the black children born to Dorothea, who required Lewis's economic support, forced him to take legal action and therefore put the case on record. As with Polly Lane and Jim, precisely because no one had stopped Dorothea and Edmond early along, they had produced offspring that made apparent some of the fallibilities of the larger slave society within which they all lived. Like Candace Lane, the children of Dorothea and Edmond illuminated an erosion of patriarchy as well as an erosion of the racial categories of black and white. Free children of partial African ancestry eroded categories of slavery and freedom based upon race. Okay, all right. Aaron Coles says, nigga is too early. Number one, don't come in here calling me a nigga if I don't know you, first and foremost. You could be a white man. Secondly, I'm in Budapest, Hungary, and over here it's 3 p.m. I know you're over there, unfortunately, in America, and I pray for you, brother. I pray for you, brother, living in America. But don't come over here on this channel with a buffalo in your profile talking to me crazy, man. Stay in America and just listen to the book, man. Listen to the book and read. Okay? That's all I got to say to you, Aaron Coles. It's Budapest, Hungary. We're over here in Europe, free. We some free niggas off the plantation. You still on the plantation. I'm helping you read, nigga. Learn, learn, learn. Okay? And definitely don't call me the N-word coming in here. That's absolutely crazy. That shows how retarded some of our people are, man. Shows how retarded some of our people are. Anyway, continuing here. This time, too, the problem of the children had brought an illicit liaison between a white woman and a black man out of the realm of gossip and scandal and into the realm of law. Yet ultimately, Virginia legal authorities understood Lewis to be at fault. Lewis's inability to govern as a patriarch, they may have reasoned, had produced free children of partial African ancestry, although the presence of such children created problems. For a society based on racial slavery, perhaps the judges felt that to leave Dorothea Bourne with no husband would allow her only to cause more trouble, both within her community and in Southern society as a whole. So yeah, basically what they're trying to say here, Martha is making a very good point that, these illicit liaisons between black men and white women at the time really, tore apart a lot of the framework that the society was working on, that there was an inherent difference between black people and white people, that the slave system was natural, that, of course, also Martha doesn't mention this, but also prevalent at the time is about the ugliness or non-attractiveness of black people, right? And there are hints of that when the lawyers are arguing stuff like nothing is more horrid or unimaginable than a white woman sleeping with a black man at the time. All right. All right. Aaron Cole says, you know what, brother, my sincerest apologies. Aaron Cole says, I was playing, but I know better than that. You know how we be wilding in the U.S. Okay, man, you got to come respectful here, man. I could take a joke, man, but I've never seen you in the chat before. And that's the thing. I've had wild white supremacists jump in my chat every single day, calling me N-words and all sort of stuff. So I don't know who you are. You get what I'm saying? But I feel you. Our people do be wilding, but I'm jumping ahead of all the work I have to do today. As you guys know, I'm an English teacher. I'm a writer. I'm also a YouTuber. I'm a husband. I also go to the gym a lot to keep this thing straight. You feel me? So I got a lot of work to do today. So I'm jumping ahead of all my YouTube responsibilities. You feel me? JK says practice slavery and cannibalism. I know I want to read The Delectable Negro. I've heard a lot about that book, but I'm tripping, man. I'm tripping. I want to read that book, but right now we're getting through this, man. So yeah, let's continue here. All right, the crimes and defiance of married white women. Although white women's requests for divorce in the antebellum South were usually based on charges of cruelty or desertion, white men White men's were usually based on charges of adultery or premarital sex. Lawmakers were more likely to consider a middling or well-to-do woman requesting divorce to be the victim of her husband's ill treatment, and more likely to deny a poorer woman such a ruling. As one legal scholar sums it up, a divorce decree was, in theory, a reward for an innocent and virtuous spouse victimized by an evil partner. For divorces initiated by white husbands in adultery cases, that was certainly so. Just as the liaison between Polly Lane and Jim was not an anomaly in the antebellum South, neither was the liaison between Dorothea Bourne and Edmond. It is impossible to know how many other cases of adultery between white women and black men were never recorded because white husbands took no legal action. Moreover, a liaison that involved a well-to-do white woman was likely to be documented by way of a slander suit rather than in a divorce record. Okay. For those white husbands who did act against transgressing wives, the petition for divorce followed a particular script. First, the man enumerated the good qualities of the woman he had once chosen to be his bride. He might note her industrious nature and would be certain to describe her as virtuous. There followed a description of the harmonious marriage that had ensued, including the husband's unfailing fulfillment of his duties. Astonishment came next when the husband learned of his wife's egregious conduct. In these cases, either the birth of a child whose father was black or the rumor of discovery of illicit congress with a black man or men. In language filled with pain, he has experienced the heart-rending mortification of the most certain evidence of infidelity. For example, the husband would name the newly discovered flaws of his wife. She was lewd, licentious, depraved, corrupt, confligate, even notorious in the neighborhood. Sometimes this description was followed by a sketch of the husband's futile suggestion for his wife's reform or of his own attempt at reconciliation. At the end, the plea for divorce was put forth. In all, the men's language gave explicit agency to their wives. Soon after their marriage in the early 1800s, for example, Hezekiah Mosby of the Virginia Piedmont suspected that his wife, Betsy, was not faithful to the marriage bed, but moreover that she bestowed her favors on men of a different color from herself. Although Lewis Bourne was unable to convince the legislature that he was the victim of his straying white wife by invoking this formula, other white men in the antebellum South had greater success. In many cases of adultery with black men, courts or legislatures were persuaded of the wife's depravity and on those grounds granted divorces to the pleading husbands. In 1794, in the North Carolina Piedmont, when Isaac Cohen's wife, Sarah, gave birth to a baby whose father appeared to be a Negro or person of color, Isaac was incredulous. Although it was evident to the whole neighborhood that the child was of African blood, Isaac refused to acknowledge the facts until the birth of a second child of the same hue with the first. Isaac was granted a divorce. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe my wife slept with a Negro until the second baby came out black. That's hilarious, man. Isaac was granted a divorce. In the winter of 1809, when Nancy Owen of Piedmont, Virginia, gave birth to a black male child, her husband felt that this fact alone justified divorce. Such a horrid violation of the marriage bed, he asserted, excused him from commenting further, though he did bring 5 witnesses before the legislature to confirm that Nancy had had a black child. Leonard was granted a divorce. When in 1810, let's keep in mind, 1810 is not a year a lot of black people want to go back to. Like if you had a time machine right now and you ask any black person, hey, what year do you want to go to? 1810, 1910, or 2010? Everybody's picking 2010. Nobody wants to go back to 1810. You feel me? So that's crazy. That's crazy. So in this time, in 1810, Elizabeth Cook of Southwestern Virginia gave birth to 2 mulatto children. And after several years of marriage, John Cook stated that the only fact and requested a divorce. So John Cook stated only that fact and requested a divorce. So 2 witnesses, one a midwife, confirmed the birth and color of Elizabeth Cook's children, and John's divorce was granted. In the case of David Parker, his first wife had deserted him, and his second marriage to Jane Miller in 1820 proved troublesome as well. Overlooking any possible fault on the part of David, Tidewater, Virginia witnesses condemned Jane, who David described as guilty of acts of the greatest lewdness, immorality, and vice. His wife, David, His wife, David said, had frequently had criminal intercourse with slaves or persons of color and had one or more children whose fathers were black. The divorce was granted. Jacob Johnson of the North Carolina Piedmont pled for a divorce in 1823, claiming that his wife Hannah had distinguished herself as an abandoned woman in points of morals and chastity by having been delivered of a colored child the previous year. Jacob's plea was successful. William Pruden of Tidewater, Virginia, described his wife as a notorious whore. He said, "My wife a big hoe." Not only had Louisa Pruden had a child by a black man, but William had, he avowed, once found her engaged in illicit intercourse with a Negro man at my own house and on my own bed. Damn, that woman was disrespectful. Hella disrespectful. Getting smashed out by the slaves on your husband's bed and the husband walking. Oh my God. In 1840, left her husband in Tidewater, Virginia, and was delivered of a colored child. Thereafter, Bryant, whose character and conduct were judged acceptable by witnesses, refused to recognize Rachel as his wife and kept the 3 legitimate children with him. In spite of his warnings, Bryant asserted Rachel continued indulging in illicit intercourse. The couple was divorced on the same day as the Prudens. Finally, Jacob Plum from Western Virginia earnestly wished to disconnect his daughter, now arriving at womanhood, from her mother, Mary Jane, who had been caught in the act of adultery with a colored man, who had a mulatto child, and who lived in open adultery with a black man. Jacob was granted his divorce in the 1840s. Let's remember, guys, slavery did not end until 1865. 1865. 1865. All this was happening. All this was happening. Decades, every single year. All right. Aaron Cole said in the comments, "You know what, bruh, not to troll you, but addressing Black Americans, I'm on the East Coast in DC. It's not even 9:30 a.m. here or 6:30 a.m. on the East Coast. Your target audience is sleep in or off to work, on their way to work in a blizzard. I just got off the office through a foot of snow." I feel you, Aaron Coles. You know what, but I'm pretty sure, my target audience, Aaron Coles, has enough know-how, wherewithal to like watch it on the playback. And I'm a busy man too, so I can't always do my live streams late in the evening according to my target audience's time. I just gotta come on here and get the work in. You know what I mean? I gotta put the work in whenever I can. And I got a lot of things to squeeze into the schedule. So that's why I'm doing the live stream now. So, you can catch it in the evening. Sometimes you can catch it in the morning, your time. But, I got to buy, Aaron Coles, I know you're not being disrespectful. I know you're trying to be honest. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the feedback. But you can always watch it on the playback. And, maybe it is working because this is the first time I've ever seen you in the chat. So maybe it is working doing it early in the morning. I don't know. Because some people might say, oh, I can't watch Simon Hill Keeps It Trill because he does it late in the afternoon. Or I can't watch Simon Hill Keeps It Trill because he does it early in the morning. The thing about this platform, you can always watch it on the playback. And besides, it's a book, man. It's a book. At the end of the day, we're supposed to be here like, soaking up the information, the game, and all that sort of stuff. You know what I'm saying? But I appreciate you, Aaron Coles. Much love to you, man. And I apologize if I was disrespectful to you earlier, but I'm hypersensitive because I have, racist white folks attack me every single day. You know what I mean? I have racist white folks in my comments every single day. I literally wake up to it every single day. Woke up to a comment this morning saying, "Nigger, go back to Africa," in my comment section. Like literally, I get that every single day. So I'm very sensitive when somebody just jumps into the chat with the first word out of their mouth being "nigger this, nigger that." You know what I mean? But anyway, continuing here. Aaron Cole says, "Got to work the algorithm in your favor." I feel that too. The thing is, the YouTube algorithm is hella random. The YouTube algorithm is hella random, and plus my channel is kind of shadow banned, I'm pretty sure. And also, let's keep it frank, I'm a sucky YouTuber. I suck at this shit. Because my goal is to be a professor in sociology one day. It's not literally to be a successful YouTuber. I'm using this platform to like practice my public speaking skills, to learn as I grow and develop. And I really don't even care about YouTube success. I just, I do get a check every month from YouTube, which I'm grateful to have. But I use this platform to just, share my experiences, give inspiration to young Black men out there, and learn, read, grow. That's it. But yeah, continuing here. Ending a marriage, even an abusive one, had serious consequences for white women in a society in which there existed few alternatives, either social or economic, to the family and household. Most married white women who entered into liaisons with Black men must have attempted secrecy at first, and those who succeeded also kept their actions out of the historical record. But secrecy was not always possible, especially in small, tightly knit communities, and evidence from other cases reveals that sex between a married white woman and a Black man sometimes, as with Dorothea and Edmond, achieved the status of general knowledge. When a married North Carolina woman accused a neighbor of stealing one of her slaves in 1810, how do you steal a slave? Like, how do you just steal a whole and it's your neighbor? Like, wait, I have to read that sentence again. A North Carolina woman accused a neighbor of stealing one of her slaves in 1810. How do you just literally steal a slave? You can't just, if he's a slave, he's going to be working outside, like in the field or in the house. And if it's a neighbor, you can like look on the porch and say, hey, is that Toby over there? Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So, for example, the neighbor retaliated by publishing a notice in the local paper stating, in regard to Mrs. Hoffer, it is a matter well known in which I am always ready to prove that whilst she was the wife of Mr. Hoffer, she took up with a mulatto man and lived with him for 12 months, and in the time had a child, which was generally believed to be the child of the said mulatto. After estrangement from her husband, Sarah Hall of the Virginia Piedmont lived in poverty with the 3 colored children she had after her marriage in 1829. One day when Sarah was visiting her mother-in-law with one of them, the elder Mrs. Hall presented the child to another visitor and asked, as to its being a white or colored child. The visitor thought the child was colored and later testified that it is generally understood and believed in the neighborhood that Sarah Hall had 2 other such children. Now, this makes me think to some degree, right? To some degree, it seems like whenever white folks back then got into a big fight amongst each other, they would just start accusing each other of like, you sleep with Negroes. Like they would accuse each other of just this to like joke, no, to like slander the other person to some degree. A husband marries a white girl, and then he realizes he doesn't like her cooking. It's too much mayonnaise. So then he just goes and tells the court, I think my wife sleeps with Negroes, right? 2 white women get into a fight at Talbot's and they accuse each other of sleeping with Negroes. And then they look at each other's kids and say, that's a mulatto baby, something like that, right? That's what it seemed like happened a lot back then. Okay. But also, of course, it was definitely happening because the courts like would ask people to present their babies, and people know when that baby looked like Charles Barkley. People know when that baby gonna come out looking like Charles Barkley. All right. I'm sorry. All right. Married women from the planter classes might also find themselves the subject of such gossip. In the 1840s, a rumor circulated in eastern North Carolina about one Mrs. Reed, whom a visiting neighbor claimed to have surprised in bed with one of her husband's slaves. Wow. When the neighbor had come to Mrs. Reed's door at night, the man jumped out of her bed and sprang through the window, carrying sash and all. The news went around at the gathering of the elite in the midst of convivial conversations in the social circle around the fireside. Though one person thought it was all too bad to talk about, white people disagreed as to whether the man had left on his own accord or had been put out of the bed through the window. When Mrs. Reed sued for slander, his lawyer spoke to the virtue and innocence of Mrs. Reed, a woman of high standing. The Reeds were awarded $500 in damages, and a request for appeal was denied. Thus did this case, or the rumor of it, go on record as slander. Although the choices for a white woman who engaged in an illicit liaison with a Black man were few, there were nonetheless various points at which she could decide among different courses of action. In spite of the hard fact that Dorothea Bourne had been caught both with Edmond and by virtue of offspring to prove the liaison, her first recorded response was simple denial. In January 1824, a white man named David Johnson, upon entering Lewis's home during the night with the motive of catching the white woman and the slave, found Edmond undressed, either going to bed or retreating from there. Late one night in November of the same year, Dorothea was discovered by neighbors and forcibly removed from a bed in the Richardson slave quarters. That's crazy. They opened the door of the slave quarters, found the white woman in there, and literally pulled her ass out. Oh man. When one of the men in the party told her to run, she followed his advice, only to be overtaken and detained in the house of another neighbor. There, the barefoot Dorothea, who also lacked hat or cape, claimed she had not in fact been in bed with Edmond, but when threatened with appearance before a magistrate, relented and promised to quit her bad practices. She said, "It wasn't me. They might have caught me in the slave quarters. It wasn't me. Caught me butt naked with Edmond. It wasn't me." she was she was in bed and then pulled "It wasn't me" on the judge. The whole town caught you in bed with the brother, man. Anyway, I'm sorry. She then signed a statement admitting that I was caught in a Negro quarter of John Richardson in bed with one of his Negroes. Signed legal paperwork. The purpose of Lewis's allies had been accomplished, and more supporting depositions for the divorce petition could thenceforward be gathered. All this suggests that Dorothea and Edmond had been observed together before, since neighbors knew where to find them. Indeed, John Richardson's wife had admitted as much when she confessed that she had often seen Dolly Bourne lurking around her Negroes' houses. But I gotta keep it real. Dorothea, the white woman, is a real one. She didn't holler rape. She didn't holler rape. She a real one for that. She could have had that brother killed, but she didn't. She a real one. She said, "Yep, I like the brothers. I like the brothers." That's what she said. That's what she said. She kept it real. She was a real one. All right. I'm going to continue here. It is impossible to know what other courses of action Dorothea may have taken before her rather pathetic attempt at denial. Like an unmarried white woman who transgressed across the color line, a married one might also try to terminate a pregnancy, especially if she was certain that the child was not her husband's. For going that route or failing at it, she might resort to infanticide. Hezekiah Mosby, for example, brought respectable ladies of the neighborhood into his wife's birthing chamber in order to ensure that someone saw Betsy Mosby's child before any accident could happen to it. For Hezekiah believed that the birth would disclose Betsy's adulterous liaison with a black man, and feared that his wife would attempt to destroy the fruits of the crime, thereby destroying his case for divorce. If a transgressing white woman had financial resources or relatives willing to come to her aid, she might flee the community. A deserting wife may have been acting out of humiliation and ostracism, or in order to escape an unhappy or abusive marriage. Alternatively, she may have been acting on orders from her husband, who would later cast himself as a victim. Jane Parker deserted David, and Elizabeth Howard moved to the next county. Similarly, in the summer of 1804, Tabitha Tatham of Virginia's Eastern Shore took her child, which was obviously the issue of an illicit intercourse with a black man, and left her husband and one legitimate child. A neighborhood report had it that she fled to Philadelphia. In the 1840s, Elizabeth Rucker gave birth to a mulatto child and moved from southwestern Virginia to Ohio. If a white woman caught in an adulterous liaison with a black man had nowhere to go or no means to get there, she might own up to her actions and amend her ways. If her husband subsequently took no legal action, the woman's misdeeds would never go on record. One such case did, however, enter the record in the memoir of two black women who recounted this story from Southside Virginia. A fellow named John Logan, who was white, was an army officer called away to fight during the War of 1812. While he was gone, his wife took up with a Negro slave on their plantation. She was already the mother of 7 daughters by her husband, and her romance with the slave produced 2 more daughters. When the husband returned, he forgave his wife, forgave her, and adopted the 2 mulatto girls as his own. They even took his last name, Logan. This slave and this white woman were our great-great-grandparents. How many other such anecdotes exist in the privacy of family histories remains unknown. Interesting, very interesting stuff. Alternatively, an adulterous white woman could own up to her actions and, rather than seek forgiveness, present herself with a measure of defiance. After her lame denial when caught in Edmond's quarters, Dorothea Bourne chose this course by offering an alternative set of facts about her husband's motives and the motives of other witnesses who supported his allegations. Though Dorothea was unhappy with Lewis and very possibly abused by him, She hoped to remain married, at least for the sake of her economic well-being. Dorothea accused Lewis's brother, William, of instigating the divorce proceedings and charged Lewis with selling off her dower, including land and livestock, to William in order to maintain himself and their legitimate children on the money. The deep interest, then, which William Bourne feels in this question of divorce between my husband and myself is so palpable, noted Dorothea in a petition of her own, written out by someone else and signed with an X, that she felt William's testimony should not be admitted in the case, and neither should that of his poor laboring dependent servant woman, Pleasant Prophet. Dorothea made a final and significant plea. In addition to 2 children she claimed were by Lewis, she had a 3rd child, a babe in arms. She did not name the father, and she trusted that the legislators would not permit her to go unprovided for. Thus, while Lewis did not want to support another man's children, Dorothea successfully invoked the lives of her children without specifying paternity in order to move the legal proceedings in her favor. If Lewis did not support Dorothea and the children, the burden would presumably fall on the community. Other white women who carried on adulterous liaisons with black men demonstrated decidedly more defiance than Dorothea Bourne. There were those who talked back, professed love for black men, and leveled more severe counter-accusations, though they did not always succeed in their endeavors. Betsy Mosby, for one, voiced her disapproval of a moral double standard. One day, when a visitor stood talking with Hezekiah Mosby, Betsy came to join the 2 men, holding her newborn. The visitor, later called to file a deposition, had no doubt that the child was begotten by a black man. And perhaps he said as much to Betsy when she answered that she had not been the first, nor would she be the last guilty of such an act, and that she saw no more harm in a white woman's having a black child than in a white man's having one, though the latter was more frequent. In the case of Elizabeth Walters, she spoke of her black partner to the messenger who delivered the divorce petition, confiding that she loved him better than anybody in the world. And Sarah Gresham from coastal Virginia defended herself by charging her husband with impotence since the start of their marriage. When Joseph accused Sarah of adultery with a black man, there was a child to prove the accusation. Sarah countered unsuccessfully that Joseph had always been incompetent to the discharge of his marital duties of sexual intercourse. Some married white women leveled counter accusations of slander at their husbands, as Lucily Whittington had done. Caroline Culpepper, whose husband had proclaimed that she sacrificed her virtue on the altar of prostitution, but who lost his case, countered that she had never been married to Thomas and therefore was not bound to answer to the false, scandalous, and defamatory charges brought against her. Rather, Caroline asserted, Thomas had seduced her before he had claimed marriage to her, and it was he who lived in open adultery with another woman. The whole demeanor of Elizabeth Fouch from the Virginia Piedmont expressed an extraordinary level of defiance. 3 years after their marriage in 1802, the millwright Isaac Fouch described his wife as of a lewd, incontinent, profligate disposition and practice. Isaac's kindness and admonitions only produced a contrary effect in Elizabeth, he said, and twice he found her in bed with James Watt, a free man of color. However, the Fouch servant, Jane Campwell, had witnessed a very particular fondness and intimacy between Elizabeth and James, and more than once, Jane had peered through an opening and seen them in the very act. At other times, Elizabeth and James went up the loft together. When Elizabeth suspected the servant woman of spying, she merely fastened the door and plugged up the hole. When Isaac, this is hilarious. People are literally looking through the peephole, watching the white woman have sex with the black man, and then she's like, "What you looking at?" As she plugs up the hole. That's hilarious. So, when Isaac finally walked out, Elizabeth remarked that he would probably never return. She asked me if I did not pity her, the servant woman recalled, adding, however, she appeared very cheerful and easy on the occasion. Jane, who had been hired by Isaac rather than by Elizabeth, may have testified as she did either out of loyalty or under pressure in any case. Isaac was granted his divorce, possibly in the instance to the satisfaction of his wife. A married white woman also had the choice to accuse a black man of rape, and some who had given birth to children that proved their illicit actions did so, though the strategy was not guaranteed to be successful. When a slave named Jefferson was accused of raping the married Elizabeth Rogers in the North Carolina Piedmont in 1845, he told the court, much as Jim had done 20 years earlier, that this intercourse by consent took place before the alleged rape and was regularly continued for several months, and that he verily believes that she is now pregnant by him. Other slaves had observed physical intimacy between Elizabeth and Jefferson, but the court excluded this testimony. When a white man testified that Jefferson had confessed the rape, Jefferson was found guilty. On appeal, however, the state Supreme Court ruled that a man accused of rape, presumably including a black man, was permitted to give evidence that the woman had been his concubine or that he had been suffered to take indecent liberties with her, again making apparent the inability of 19th century law to imagine rape within a consensual relationship. A married white woman who consorted with a black man and found herself pregnant surely fretted over whether the child belonged to the white husband or the black partner. Some must have prayed fervently that it would be impossible to tell if the child had a black father. Perhaps a rape accusation was less pressing for a married white woman, for a pregnant wife was not yet inherently guilty of anything. There may have been a chance that the child belonged to her husband, and there was always a chance that it would be presumed white by the community. Although these white women suffered economic and social consequences for their liaisons with black men, not all set out to reform their behavior. Perhaps they felt they had less to lose than unmarried white women in the same circumstances. Single women always had the possibility of a brighter future if they could allay rumors about past misconduct. Although some of the behavior of the married women after the discovery of their offenses was defiant, these women were presumably forced into such a stance by the discovery itself. The defiance was a last resort. Elizabeth Walters, the woman who had professed love for a slave man, for example, felt it unfair that her husband drove her off before he knew whether it would be a black child or not, indicating her attempt to keep the illicit liaison secret. The documents remain largely silent as to motivations, yet in their behavior, these white women jeopardized their marriages and livelihoods and suffered the consequences of ostracism and poverty. Perhaps for white women in unendurable marriages, such actions were merely one bleak choice among a limited number of equally bleak choices. The conviction that a white patriarch was responsible for his wife's illicit actions did not make the gossip any less vicious. White women were still subject to patriarchal control, and local authorities branded transgressors harshly. Yet it is crucial to realize that even when legal authorities and white communities alike understood dishonorable white wives like Dorothea Bourne to be the victims of abusive white husbands, neither the law nor the white neighbors cast their adulterous white women as the victims of the black men with whom they had sex. So, the silence and defiance of black men. The liaison between Dorothea, the white woman, and Edmond, the black slave, was common knowledge. But only when Dorothea's husband entered a divorce plea did his friends and neighbors act. Their purpose was to prove Dorothea's guilt. And although this was readily accomplished, the Virginia legislature denied Louis Bourne his divorce. While there was no doubt that Dorothea had carried on a liaison with a black man, there was sufficient suspicion that Louis had abused a wife he was unable to control, and that factor outweighed other evidence. This reiteration of facts is to say that the contest was between the transgressions of Dorothea, the white wife, and the transgressions of Louis, her white husband. The behavior of Edmond, the black man, was not a factor in the minds of either local or legal authorities. The fates of some of the black men in adulterous liaisons can be gleaned, but their motivations and sentiments are more difficult to discern. Dorothea had a petition of her own among the collection of documents on the Bourne divorce case. Edmond's voice is a great deal more elusive because black men in such circumstances were not called upon to explain their transgression in any public forum. They wisely offered nothing to white people. Within his own family or community, Edmond surely dealt with the consequences of a liaison with a white woman, but just about the only thoughts attributed to Edmond or any black person in the documents come from his master. John Richardson, who recounted, "I have good reason for believing this man of mine has been disposed to forsake this woman, which has produced considerable discontent in her, and has been the cause of her often visiting my Negro houses and staying all night in the quarters. If this story is true, Edmond was less than a completely willing partner in the liaison with Dorothea, and Dorothea imposed herself on Edmond at least some of the time. Not only is it impossible to trace events on this point, but Dorothea and Edmond themselves probably understood the circumstances of their liaison in different ways. From Edmond's point of view, consenting to sex with a white woman may have contained an element of defiance. No matter what various people thought and transpired over the 2 years or longer in which Dorothea and Edmond had sex, Edmond was likely neither a complete victim nor, as an enslaved black man in the antebellum South, could he have been a free agent. For Edmond, too, the liaison with Dorothea may have been one choice among bleak and limited choices. Perhaps he deemed an enduring relationship with a black woman too risky, for example, entailing the possibility of separation through sale, or his own powerlessness in the face of white sexual abuse or violence toward her. I mean, we have to think about this, man. I mean, Edmond, the black slave, is being propositioned in a sort of way that's kind of like rape. I mean, this white woman technically is the owner of him, and she's, coming on to him, trying to have sex with him. And as the, black person who was enslaved at this point, he has really no choice. It's sort of like master says, you're going to give me that dick. And so he had to give her that dick, unfortunately. So, yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, the book hasn't really covered that point until then. And I'm actually sad I didn't even think about that until now. Continuing here. A clue may lie in two depositions filed on behalf of Lewis Bourne, if taken in conjunction with John Richardson's story that Edmond at some time wished to forsake Dorothea's affections. First, the 11 neighbors who felt Lewis was justified in beating his wife came forward to refute rumors that Lewis had once ordered Dorothea whipped by a black man. Second, Joseph Perkins, who had known Lewis for 2 decades, recalled hearing of a fight that took place a few years past between Dorothea and a slave belonging to Lewis's brother, in which Dorothea came away with some bruises. These witnesses wished to assert that Lewis had never set a slave violently upon his wife, opening up the possibility that the elderly Lewis had done exactly that in his efforts to get his aberrant wife to obey him. But it is also conceivable that this testimony points to a scenario of conflict between Dorothea Bourne and another slave man in the neighborhood, thereby possibly backing up John Richardson's version of the liaison between Dorothea and Edmond. Edmond's master had good reason to paint Dorothea as the perpetrator, leaving his slave property safe from a bad reputation. But it is not completely out of the question that the slave who beat Dorothea had been coming to the defense of Edmond for trying to put a stop to unwanted advances toward himself. All that is certain is that Dorothea suffered in some measure, perhaps severely, as a result of the liaison, and that Edmond himself may have suffered a great deal as well. Did I read that right? Dorothea came away with some bruises. Lewis had once ordered Dorothea whipped by a black man. Yeah, this is once again. I mean, this is a type of history I did not even know existed. Before reading this book, I couldn't even imagine a white man telling his black slave, whip my white wife for sleeping with you or sleeping with the brothers. You get what I'm saying? Like, that's crazy. Once again, it shows like how patriarchy, like we can end up working hand in hand. White men and black men work hand in hand to oppress women. But goddamn, that's crazy. I couldn't even imagine such an idea. A white husband in the antebellum South tells his black slave, whip my white wife for sleeping with black men. Come on now, that's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, history, what you find in a book. This is why they don't want black men to read. This is why I will always do the Book to React series on my channel for as long as I live, because they hide so much information from us in these books. There's so much interesting, cool, informative stuff, transformational stuff you find in between these pages that can reify your life as a black man, right? Because I have to now rethink my whole worldview about what slavery was like just off of these narratives, right? This is an amazing book. Highly recommend it, man. Hella dope book. Anyway, continuing here. So all that is certain is that Dorothea suffered in some measure, perhaps severely, as a result of the liaison, and that Edmond himself may have suffered a great deal as well. Edmond's voice may remain largely inaudible on the dynamics of this liaison, but in a few other antebellum cases, the voices of Black men, both slave and free, have been preserved. In these instances, the level of defiance matches that of some of their partners. In 1847, in the North Carolina Piedmont, a slave named George was charged with the murder of a white man named James Meadows. George had not only stabbed and beaten James, but also, with both his hands, fixed and fastened about the penis and testicles of James. Wait, what? What? Okay. Wait. What happened? So in 1847, in the North Carolina Piedmont, a slave named George was charged with the murder of a white man named James Meadows. George had not only stabbed and beaten James, but also, with both his hands, fixed and fastened about the penis and testicles of James. He did violently squeeze. So this Black guy grabs a white man by the dick and squeezes it, okay, as a part of the murder of him. James's wife was named an accessory in the crime, and witnesses noted that Mary Meadows had shown hostility to her husband, and that there was evidence of a guilty connection between Mary and the slave man. George was sentenced to death in county court, but on appeal, the judgment was reversed on the technicalities regarding the evidence of a conspiracy between Mary and George. Wow. Okay, did not expect that. So this Black man kills a white man, and people assume that the Black man is working in conjunction with the white wife, Mary Meadows, because I guess she didn't like her husband. And the Black man is, of course, sentenced to death for killing the white guy. But then the judgment gets reversed. It gets reversed. Because they say there was actually a conspiracy between Mary and George to murder her white husband. Wow. Got to catch my breath for that. The case of Redding Evans in southern Georgia in the volatile late 1850s reveals a stark example of defiance on the part of a Black man who entered into an adulterous liaison with a white woman. Redding was a free man of color who kept the company of a woman named Mrs. Smith, who lived apart from her husband, James. Redding Evans and James Smith had an antagonistic relationship on account of Evans' criminal intimacy with Smith's wife. When James Smith complained that Redding Evans' chickens were eating his corn, for example, Redding told the white man to leave those chickens alone or he might kill him. On another occasion, Redding promised to cut the white man's throat if he bothered him. One day, when Redding Evans and Mrs. Smith were in bed together, James Smith ordered the Black man out of the house. Now listen, Negro, I'm tired of you sleeping with my wife. Now get out of the house. James said, I'm sick of this, man. Get out of my house. Stop fucking my wife. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. On another occasion, Redding promised to cut the white man's throat if he bothered him. One day, when Redding Evans and Mrs. Smith were in bed together, James Smith ordered the Black man out of the house. Failing in this demand, James Smith departed, but Redding Evans followed him and knocked him down and made him come back in the house and sit down. And Evans went back to bed with Smith's wife in the presence of Smith and his children. C-U-C-K, just cucked all over. My God. Oh God, this is badass behavior. Redding Evans, badass. That was a real Black man. That man was Black dynamite. Him and Delks, I forgot the brother's name, Delks Howards, Delks Moses, something like that. The Black guy that was like slapping white men and sleeping with white women, and you know what I mean, just shooting at white folks. This guy, Redding Evans, is a G. Delks Moses is a G too. Continuing here. So another morning, James Smith, the white guy, tried to retrieve his children because he had heard that Redding Evans, the Black guy, was going to run away with his wife. At the same time, the Black man was approaching the house. The white man pulled his shotgun and fired at the Black man, Redding Evans, wounded, then fired at James Smith 5 times, killing him. So Redding Evans killed a white man and then got to continue sleeping with his wife. In these 2 cases, the Black men were on trial not for sex with a white woman, but for violence toward a white man. Although that may not have differed had the black men been white men, the conscious resistance to white authority behind the actions of these transgressing black men, caught in an already dangerous endeavor, is significant, if not remarkable. The slave, George, was allowed to live, almost certainly because of his value as property. The free man, Redding Evans, was convicted of murder in 1861, as white Southerners clamped down on free people of color with the coming of war. The execution was presumably carried out. As for local white people's reactions to black men who consorted with married white women, neither indignity nor outrage were detectable in the documents. To be sure, white husbands in some of the divorce cases explicitly indicated that adultery with a black man was more deplorable than the same crime with a white man. Joseph Gresham, for example, proclaimed that his wife's adulterous behavior was aggravated by the fact that it was committed and carried on with a man of color. Thomas Kane from Virginia's Shenandoah Valley charged his wife with adultery of the most aggravated character because she had twice become the mother of black children who could not be other than the fruits of an adulterous intercourse with a Negro. Other white husbands no doubt assumed that lawmakers and judges would find adultery with a black man extremely offensive. Some took pains to state this explicitly in order to bolster their cases. Isaac Fouch, for example, first wrote about his wife's illicit partner by name and later inserted the words "a man of color," indicating the salience of race to his quest for divorce. Nonetheless, taking offensiveness for granted did not warrant violent reprisal toward black men who were sexually involved with white women. Recall the winter's night scene in 1823 in which white neighbors ensnared Dorothea and Edmond in Edmond's slave quarters. Not only was Dorothea the target of the trap, but capturing Edmond did not concern those who participated in the vigilante episode that followed. No mob went after the slave man. When Dorothea was forced from Edmond's bed in the Richardson slave quarters, it was she who was chased and captured, precisely because her husband hoped to use the evidence for his divorce plea. That the neighbors chased Dorothea into the night indicates that they were not seeking out Edmond for punishment, at least not at that moment, nor at any other moment recorded over 2 years in all of the descriptions of that illicit liaison. Of course, because Edmond was the property of another white person, neither Lewis nor anyone else could take revenge without intruding on John Richardson's rights. And it is certainly possible that Edmond suffered violence at the hands of his master. Even though John Richardson would later defend his slave by blaming Dorothea for the liaison, still the detailed narratives in many depositions contain no hint of any public or private violent retribution toward Edmond, nor of white neighbors' wishes for violent retribution to be carried out by Edmond's master. Nor do the documents contain the least expression of white outrage, nor even a glimmer of the most casual disapproval toward the slave man for his liaison with a white woman. Indeed, other black men were named in their antebellum Southern communities as transgressors with white women, as with Edmond, there is no record of white people seeking these men out for violent revenge. The partner of the defiant Elizabeth Fouch, for example, was identified as James Watt, a free man of color whom one witness had known from his infancy. When Isaac Fouch finally left his wife, Elizabeth set off with the remaining household possessions loaded onto a wagon, and James Watt followed her in a little time after. The two were followed in turn by a constable, but all he wanted was the portion of the Fouch property that Isaac owed someone. In the case of Rebecca Bayless, also of the Virginia Piedmont, her husband proclaimed her to be guilty of living in open adultery with a free man of color named Wilfred Mortimer, with whom she continued to live after her husband sought a divorce. William Howard of the Virginia Piedmont had found his wife undressed and in bed with a certain Eldridge Evans, a black man of color, a black man. In the Piedmont, Virginia divorce case of Daniel and Henrietta Rose in 1806, the father of Henrietta's child was recognized as a slave belonging to Henrietta's grandfather. In 1813, in eastern North Carolina, James Halford pled that his wife did take up with a man by the name of John Lowens, a person of color by whom she had a child. The 1824 petition of shoemaker Louis Tombaugh in eastern North Carolina told of finding his wife Peggy cohabited cohabiting with a certain mulatto barber named Roland Calanche, then living in Williamston, with whom she had one child. Rather than describing a violent conflict, however, the cobbler explained how his own poverty prevented him from exacting any redress without making a fool of himself. In the 1832 petition of John Johnson, the white husband claimed that his wife had formed an attachment with a free black man with whom he farmed in the North Carolina Piedmont. The foregoing documents indicate unequivocally that the black men in these adulterous liaisons were named and known. Other black men are not identified by name in the documents, but were clearly known to cohabit with white women. For example, those who lived with Louisa Pruden, whose husband found them in bed together, Mary Jane Plum, Tabitha Hancock, and Elizabeth Walters. On the other side, it seems that if no one beyond the white woman herself knew which black man had been her illicit partner, white neighbors made no attempt to identify or find the male transgressor. Although Elizabeth Walters told the messenger who delivered the divorce petition that she was not the first or only white woman that the Negro had taken in, no white reactions of fury to that statement are on record. It's not possible to know all that came to pass prior to the recording of any liaison, yet not a shadow of an enraged white person, not an inkling or an intimation of vigilante violence, not a faint or distant echo of a call to physical revenge appears in any of the recorded cases. If the man were enslaved, white people probably considered his offenses to be within the purview of his master, and some of these men may well have suffered within their own quarters. Again, it is impossible to know if John Richardson beat Edmond on discovering his liaison with Dorothea Bourne, or threatened to sell away loved ones, or tormented him in some other way. At the same time, because the white women in these cases were married, the matter of the transgressing man was likely considered to be within the purview of the white husband, and black men, like white men who had sex with married white women, may have suffered at the hands of angry white patriarchs, although once again, no evidence whatsoever exists to support that conjecture. Although white Southern men did not take the matter of adultery between a white woman and a black man lightly or in stride, just as they did not take any sexual transgression of white women in stride, neither did rage and retribution based on the race of the man inevitably follow from local knowledge. In the case of free black men who transgressed with white women, a clue may be taken from antebellum rape cases. The lack of inevitable white violence in cases of adultery with white women may have stemmed in part from the value of free black men as low-wage workers. The execution of the free Redding Evans, who owned at least his own chickens, indicates that white people considered free black men who enjoyed some economic independence more dangerous. In fact, Redding's death sentence foreshadows the fate of black men after the Civil War, when whites conflated black male autonomy with sexual transgressions against the color line. Finally, because these white women were married, local authorities were less concerned with the support of bastard children. Instead, the white husbands would have to take responsibility, as did Louis Bourne, whom the sheriff warned about having to care for them mulatto children for the rest of his life. Such a problem could plague white men even after death. In 1858, in Tidewater, Virginia, a white man's executor sought to cut out of the man's will the 3 Negro children born, presumably to his wife, between the date of his will and the time of his death. At least some of the free black men who engaged in liaisons with white women became the children's caretakers, either voluntarily or by legal order. The illegitimate child of Louisa Pruden, for example, lived with the reputed father, a free Negro. The illegitimate child of Rachel Rawls lived as a pauper in the house of a free Negro by an order of the county overseers of the poor. This measure may have been the equivalent of bounding out the children of unmarried white women as apprentices, a way to control the comings and goings of free people of partial African ancestry, and therefore a way to minimize disruptions to the equation of African ancestry and slavery. Although Edmond was not free, one of the white witnesses had heard Dorothea tell Edmond that he must take the child she had and provide for it, as it was his child. Edmond's voice emerges here, for he agreed to do so if Dorothea would tell him it was his child, meaning if Dorothea were absolutely sure that the child was not her husband's. Of course, as a slave, it is hard to know how Edmond could have provided for a child. Perhaps Dorothea imagined the child being raised in the slave quarters and cared for by the Richardsons. There were then Black men in the antebellum South who participated in liaisons with married white women, who lived with married white women or with their illegitimate children by those women, or who ran away with married white women. Only if a Black man took revenge on a white husband in the form of violence, as the enslaved George and the free Redding Evans had done, were they sure to be called into court. Even then, the cause of the court appearance would be violence toward a white man. Although they consorted with white women, these Black men were not automatically assumed by their white neighbors to be rapists or even seducers of white women. They were not systematically sought out in a white frenzy if no one knew their identity, and they did not suffer public retribution if anyone or everyone did. In the recollection about a white soldier in the War of 1812 who forgave his wife for her affair with a Black man, the family's descendants wrote, "No one remembers what happened to the slave except he must have left town in a big hurry. Perhaps the man did run away, or perhaps no one could remember because the man was simply not the focus of local attention." When Lewis Bourne filed for divorce, his major concern was the support of children not his own. Lewis's ineffective control over Dorothea illuminated an imperfectly functioning patriarchy, which in turn produced free children of partial African ancestry, children who then served to expose some of the imperfections of racial slavery. White neighbors and acquaintances all along cast Dorothea Bourne as the guilty party, but the Virginia legislature did not agree with that judgment. Although white community members had judged Dorothea to be the victim only of her own depraved sexual nature, legal authorities viewed her also as the victim of her white husband. Neither local nor legal authorities cast Dorothea as the victim of Edmond, the Black man. And although Lewis did not get his divorce, white husbands under the same circumstances were often granted their wishes precisely because their white wives were understood to be so degraded. That a white woman's illicit partner was a Black man in no way indicated to white authorities that she had been forced into the crime. Far fewer questions emerge about what came to pass between Dorothea Bourne and Edmond than about the circumstances of Polly Lane and Jim's liaison. Whereas Polly repeatedly refused to name Jim as the father of her child, it took little to scare Dorothea into signing a statement that implicated Edmond. True, just as Polly's father could not control his daughter, Dorothea's husband could not control his wife. Yet a major difference between the two cases lay in the accusation of rape. The life of a valuable slave was at stake in the case of Polly and Jim, but not in the case of Dorothea and Edmond. In the case of Polly and Jim, the Black man was on trial. In the case of Dorothea and Edmond, the Black man was never asked to tell his story and never as much in need of the defense of a powerful white people. No white person ever considered taking the life of John Richardson's valuable slave because he had sex with a disreputable white woman in the neighborhood. In the case of Dorothea and Edmond, all that was at stake was the financial situation of a white husband who had long ago relinquished his honor as well as his authority over his transgressing white wife. Still, as in the liaison between Polly and Jim, the consequences of the liaison, rather than the liaison by itself, spurred local whites into action. Those consequences were the offspring of a white woman and a Black man. That is not to say that white husbands tolerated their wives' affairs with Black men, nor with white men, if no children were produced. But when children were born to a white woman and a Black man, there was so much more at stake. No one had stopped Dorothea and Edmond until Dorothea's husband decided he didn't want to support another man's child. Dorothea and Edmond's liaison did not stir up white rage, but it did unsettle the local social order. Like Candace Lane, the children of Dorothea and Edmond gave the lie to the infallibility of the Southern social structure. Because Lewis Bourne was not granted a divorce, Dorothea's life with her husband probably continued much as it had before. The liaison with Edmond may have continued, or perhaps once the community became enmeshed in the scandal, it came to an end. Or if John Richardson was correct, perhaps Edmond was an agent in ending the liaison. Whatever sentiments Edmond may have had toward his children went unrecorded. After Lewis's death in the mid-1830s, Dorothea and her children surely suffered economically. In his will, Lewis left all his land to his son Thomas, the only child he called his own. Lewis referred to each of the two other children, Fanny and Mary Bourne, as my wife's daughter, which I do not believe to be my child, and left each girl $1. Dorothea inherited nothing. The census of Louisa County, taken in 1850, lists Dolly Bourne as the 60-year-old head of a household, living with her daughter, Mary Bourne, 30 years old, and perhaps 2 grandchildren. She had no occupation and no property. There is a final twist to the story of Dorothea and Edmond. Like his children with Dorothea, Edmond was of mixed African and European ancestry. Although some white people described Edmond as Negro, mulatto, or a man of color, other descriptions reveal more ambiguous white perceptions. One man called Edmond a remarkable white slave, and another concurred that Dorothea had taken up with a white slave. John Richardson described Edmond as white as any white men generally are. In spite of this perception, however, the same witnesses were certain that the father of Dorothea's illegitimate children was Negro or black, and that the children were of partial African ancestry. One person, for example, was sure that one of the children must have had a black father, and another said the children were by a black Negro. One neighbor stated that Dorothea's last child, although to all appearances white, is by a slave. Many describe the illegitimate children as of dark complexion, colored, mulatto, black, and Negro. Thus, although Edmond appeared remarkably white, he was thoroughly understood to be black within the confines of his own locality. His enslaved status served to identify him as a black Negro, because slavery was synonymous with blackness, at least ideally. Edmond's appearance may have unsettled the rigidity of racial categories, but his status as a slave placed him firmly in the social hierarchy of the antebellum South. After all, everyone who passed him in the neighborhood knew that he lived in John Richardson's Negro houses. In Edmond's children, with a white woman, however, the effort to keep people of African ancestry in slavery was unsuccessful. Their existence eroded not only categories of race based upon color, but also categories of slavery and freedom based upon racial designations. Everyone in town knew that those children were of partial African ancestry. They were colored, mulatto, black, and Negro, and yet they were free. As such, they were troublesome to whites in a way that the enslaved children of a white man and a black woman could never be. And yet, ultimately, it did not matter so much, except for those who wished to help out Lewis Bourne, because the institution of slavery, for the most part, kept people of African ancestry in slavery, even in slavery. Kept people of African ancestry in slavery, even where that ancestry might be invisible. Again, the contradiction. The liaison between a white woman and a black man did not sufficiently threaten the institution of racial slavery, but the production of children made apparent defects in the Southern social structure. In the case of Dorothea Bourne and Edmond, there was no argument about whether a white woman and a black man had carried out an illicit liaison. However, subjectively, those racial categories were construed. The woman was white and the man was a slave, even if a remarkable white one. In the stories that follow, however, it became clear that in other cases involving white women and black men in the antebellum South, questions of race and color could prove to be major points of contention. And that's the end of chapter 4. This is going to be the end of part 4 of our reading of White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South. And I got to say, man, that chapter we just read was highly fascinating. You know, I'm always shocked by what I learned by history. And this book, once again, is very transformative for me because this is a brand of history that I feel like purposely they don't want to show. I mean, let's think about it, right? Like when they tell history, they always say that, you know, black men could be killed just for looking at a white woman. Black men would be murdered for the accusations of rape and stuff like that. But there's never those stories. The only story I can think of is maybe like the movie Life. Remember in the movie Life, the brothers were playing baseball. Then there was like this, you know, mentally challenged brother who was playing baseball, and he ends up like sleeping with the warden's daughter. And then all the prisoners come up and say, "That's my baby, Paul. That's my baby." Anybody could tell I'm the father of that baby, Paul. Like all the brothers started laughing and joking and jonesing because of that. That's like the only movie I can think of where, you know, that's even hinted at. And even then, that's not slavery. Like that's chain gang, you know, post-slavery, right? But like, You know, this is like one of those books where they talk about like the defiance of Black people, how we always fought against slavery, how we were maroons and stuff like that as well. Like I'm finding so much like joy knowing that we weren't just so beaten down, that our sexuality could be somewhat free, even at such a high cost, right? But yeah, that's just my take on chapter 4. There's so much more in chapter 4 that I could talk about for hours and hours, but I'm gonna wrap this up because I got other stuff to do today. But y'all be easy out there. This is Simon Hill Keeps It Trill reading for Book React 4. Y'all be easy out there. Catch y'all maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Stay tuned. Peace.